That's quite the costume you've got on, but I'm afraid we have a dress code here. That's what the maître d' whispered as she led Sergeant Bennett to a shadowy corner of the restaurant, far from the other guests. By the time the wine hit his uniform, the message was clear. Guardsmen weren't welcome. But one phone call from Buckingham Palace would change everything. So who picked up on the other end? Before we answer that, press the subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. The polished black boots of Sergeant Malcolm Bennett remained perfectly still against the white limestone of the palace forecourt. 6 hours into his shift, not a single muscle betrayed the growing fatigue in his body. His scarlet tunic gleamed in the afternoon sun, gold buttons and white belts meticulously aligned, the bearskin cap adding nearly a foot to his already impressive height. Malcolm's eyes remained fixed forward, his face an expressionless mask that revealed nothing of his thoughts. Behind that disciplined exterior, his mind drifted briefly to Lieutenant Alastair Penrose, who would normally be arriving for the evening shift in less than 30 minutes. The call had come through at dawn. Alastair had been hospitalized with severe pneumonia, leaving the guard rotation one man short. Without hesitation, Malcolm had volunteered to stand a double shift. A young boy waved enthusiastically from beyond the barrier, his mother attempting to capture the perfect photograph. "He's not allowed to move or smile," she explained, though the child continued his efforts to elicit a response. Malcolm maintained his 1,000-yard stare, though inwardly he appreciated the child's enthusiasm. After 15 years with the Queen's Guard, such interactions had become familiar. What the fascinated onlookers couldn't see was Malcolm's history. The 3 tours of combat duty in Afghanistan, before his selection for the Ceremonial Guard, the bullet scar on his shoulder from an ambush outside Kandahar, the Medal for Valour locked in his modest apartment's drawer. To them, he was a tourist attraction. To his fellow servicemen, he was among the elite, having earned this position through distinguished service. As the shadows lengthened across the forecourt, marking nearly 8 hours on his feet, Malcolm felt the familiar burning in his calves and lower back. The second shift still had 4 hours remaining. He drew on the same mental discipline that had sustained him through grueling special operations training, focusing his mind away from the discomfort. The ceremonial changing of the guard approached with its familiar precision. After 12 hours of near motionless vigilance, the timing of the changing ceremony had never been more welcome. Captain Charles Redgrave stood observing from the sidelines, his experienced eye missing nothing. Known throughout the regiment for his unwavering standards, Redgrave had served 25 years with distinction before taking command of this rotation. The relief guard assumed position with practiced precision. Only when the ceremony completed was Malcolm finally permitted to move, his first steps accompanied by the subtle crackling of joints that had remained stationary for too long. "Sergeant Bennett!" Captain Redgrave called as Malcolm marched from his position. "A moment, if you please." Malcolm approached and stood at attention, though his body silently protested the continued formality after 12 hours of duty. "Sir?" Redgrave's stern expression softened almost imperceptibly. "At ease, Sergeant. That was quite a demonstration of dedication today." "Just doing my duty, sir," Malcolm responded, shifting to a slightly more comfortable parade rest position. "Double shifts are beyond the call of duty, especially in this heat," Redgrave countered. Lieutenant Penrose called from hospital to express his gratitude. The captain reached into his uniform pocket and withdrew an elegant, cream-coloured envelope with an embossed gold seal. "I had planned to use this myself next week, but I believe you've earned it today." "It's a dinner voucher for the Sovereign Room," Redgrave explained. "London's finest dining establishment, full service, all expenses covered." Malcolm's eyebrows rose slightly. The Sovereign Room was legendary. Exclusive, elegant, and typically requiring reservations months in advance. "The owner, Lord Richard Montgomery, is an old friend," Redgrave continued. We served together before he left the military to pursue his passion for fine dining. I'd recommend the Dover sole if it's on tonight's menu." "Thank you, Captain," Malcolm said, carefully tucking the envelope into his pocket. "This is unexpected, but much appreciated." "You've more than earned it, Sergeant," Redgrave replied with a nod. "The restaurant is open until midnight if you're inclined to go this evening." Malcolm emerged from the guardsman's quarters, still in his full ceremonial uniform. He had briefly considered changing into civilian clothes, but decided against it. The uniform represented the institution he served, and wearing it was a matter of pride. The evening air had cooled London's streets, providing welcome relief after the day's heat. Malcolm's aching muscles protested each step, yet something in him resisted the easy path. "I can always rest tomorrow," he murmured to himself, tucking the voucher safely in his inner pocket. The reaction to his uniform on the tube was immediate. A seat was promptly offered by a businessman who nodded respectfully. Two young children stared openly from across the carriage, one finally asking, "Are you a real guard?" "It's quite all right," Malcolm assured the apologetic mother with a small smile. "Yes, I am. Just finished my shift and heading to dinner." An elderly gentleman sitting nearby leaned forward. "Korean War veteran myself," he said quietly. "Different uniform, same pride. Enjoy your evenings, son." Malcolm exited at Green Park Station and walked to Mayfair. The restaurant's facade was understated yet elegant. A simple brass plaque beside imposing double doors. Two uniformed doormen stood at attention. With renewed resolution, Malcolm straightened his already perfect posture and approached the entrance. "Good evening, sir," one said with practiced deference. "Welcome to the Sovereign Room." Inside, crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over ivory linens and gleaming silverware. As Malcolm entered, several conversations momentarily stilled. The maître d', a slender woman with her blonde hair pulled back in an immaculate chignon, looked up with a practiced smile that faltered upon seeing his uniform. "Good evening," she said. "Do you have a reservation?" Her tone carried the slightest hint of doubt. "Good evening," Malcolm replied with perfect courtesy. "I have a voucher from Captain Charles Redgrave." He presented the envelope, which she accepted with manicured fingers. "One moment, please." She stepped away and whispered something to a man in a tailored suit. After a brief conversation, the man approached. "I'm Philip Harrington, floor manager," he introduced himself with a thin smile. "We weren't expecting ceremonial personnel this evening. The voucher appears to be in order, though." "Captain Redgrave spoke highly of your establishment." "Yes, well," Philip replied, "Miranda will show you to your table." Though several prime tables sat empty near the centre of the dining room, Miranda led Malcolm to a corner table partially hidden behind a decorative column, the type of table typically reserved for the least desirable guests. Several minutes passed before a waiter approached. "Good evening," he said, looking somewhere past Malcolm's shoulder. "I'm Sebastian. I'll be your server." "Have you dined with us before?" Sebastian asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer. "First time," Malcolm confirmed. "I thought as much," Sebastian replied, with a faint hint of condescension. "Our menu might be a bit sophisticated for first-time guests. Perhaps I could suggest something accessible?" Malcolm simply opened the menu. "I'd prefer to review the options myself, thank you." 20 minutes passed before Sebastian returned with water, though Malcolm observed him serving 3 other tables that had been seated after his arrival. "Have you decided?" Sebastian asked, notepad poised with theatrical readiness. "I believe I'll start with the seared scallops," Malcolm replied. Sebastian's eyebrows rose slightly. "An excellent choice, though perhaps I should mention that the scallops are priced at £35 for the starter portion. The voucher covers up to £300, but with wine pairings you may wish to choose more economically." "I understand the pricing," he replied evenly. "For the main course, I'll have the Dover sole. Captain Redgrave recommended it highly." "The captain has conventional tastes. Perhaps you'd prefer something more adventurous?" Each recommendation came with the same subtle condescension. Throughout the ordering process, Manager Philip hovered nearby, occasionally exchanging knowing glances with Sebastian. "Will there be someone joining you this evening?" Sebastian asked, implying Malcolm's solitary state was somehow inappropriate. "No, just me." "How unusual! We rarely see solitary diners, especially in—" Sebastian's eyes swept over the ceremonial uniform. "Costume." The deliberate mischaracterization of his uniform as a costume was impossible to miss. Before Malcolm could respond, Sebastian continued, "I assume you're directly from your post? Quite a commitment to remain dressed for tourists even after hours." "This isn't a costume," Malcolm corrected calmly. "It's the ceremonial uniform of the Queen's Guard." "Of course," Sebastian replied with a thin smile. "How theatrical." Malcolm overheard Sebastian's hushed conversation with another server as they walked away. "Thinks he's someone important." "Tourists should stay at the palace where they belong," came the response, followed by muffled laughter. Malcolm's appetizer arrived after nearly 40 minutes, an unusually long wait not shared by other diners. The scallops, while beautifully presented, were barely lukewarm, suggesting they had been left sitting before delivery. When Sebastian returned to clear the appetizer plate, he carried a bottle of red wine. "Our sommelier recommends this Bordeaux with your main course, though perhaps it's more sophisticated than what you're accustomed to in the barracks." Malcolm's main course arrived after another extended wait. Sebastian placed it before him with theatrical formality. "Your fish, sir, though I must say most of our patrons would have selected something more sophisticated." As Malcolm ate, Manager Philip approached his table. "Is everything satisfactory?" he asked, his tone suggesting he expected complaints. "The food is excellent," Malcolm replied honestly. "Surprising that you can tell," Philip remarked with a thin smile. "Most of our guests develop their palates over years of fine dining, not guard duty." As Sebastian approached to refill Malcolm's wine glass, his hand tilted sharply, sending a stream of deep red Bordeaux cascading directly onto Malcolm's scarlet tunic. Time seemed to slow. The wine darkened the pristine wool of his uniform. Sebastian stepped back with an exaggerated display of shock, though the brief flash of satisfaction in his eyes betrayed the truth. Malcolm remained perfectly still, reaching for his napkin. "Accidents happen," he said quietly. Sebastian's lips curled slightly. "The wine will never come out of that costume. Perhaps it's for the best. Might be time to replace it with something more contemporary anyway." "This is not a costume," he stated, his voice low but carrying authority. "This uniform represents centuries of service and tradition. Men have died wearing it with honour." Sebastian's expression shifted to mock offence. "Sir, there's no need to become aggressive. It was a simple accident." "The uniform of the Queen's Guard deserves respect," Malcolm continued, rising slowly to his feet, "as do those who earn the right to wear it." Manager Philip materialized beside the table. "Is there a problem here?" "Your server deliberately spilled wine on my uniform," Malcolm stated calmly, "then insulted both the uniform and, by extension, the institution it represents." "I did nothing of the sort," Sebastian protested. "It was an accident, and now he's becoming hostile." "I'm afraid we can't have disruptions in our dining room," Philip said. "Our guests expect a certain atmosphere." "The only disruption has been the systematic disrespect shown since my arrival. Perhaps establishments like ours aren't suitable for military personnel. There are many fine pubs that might be more appropriate for your station." "I think it would be best if you departed now," Philip stated, no longer bothering with pretense. "We'll consider the voucher used, of course." Malcolm looked at the wine stains spreading across his uniform. With the same dignity that had carried him through countless ceremonial duties, he placed his napkin beside his half-eaten meal. "Very well," he said quietly, meeting Philip's gaze directly. "But Captain Redgrave will hear of this. "I'm sure we'll survive the captain's disappointment," Philip replied dismissively. "Sebastian, please show our guest to the door." With perfect military bearing, Malcolm walked toward the exit. At the door, Sebastian couldn't resist one final barb. "Perhaps next time, come in proper civilian attire. The costume is a bit much for serious dining." At home, Malcolm carefully treated the wine stain on his tunic, using an old regimental trick of cold water and salt. After hanging it to dry, he found little in his refrigerator to satisfy his hunger after the long day. The irony wasn't lost on him. Having been presented with a voucher for one of London's finest restaurants, he was ending his evening hungry in a sparsely stocked apartment. The next morning at the palace, the changing ceremony proceeded with typical precision. Malcolm took his position, his face betraying nothing of the previous evening's humiliation. Captain Redgrave observed from his usual position. When duties transitioned, Redgrave approached. "Sergeant Bennett," he called, "a word." "At ease," Redgrave said, studying Malcolm's face. "You look like you've had insufficient rest. Was yesterday's double shift too taxing?" "No, sir. I'm perfectly capable of performing my duties." "And how was your dinner at the Sovereign Room? Did you take my recommendation for the Dover sole?" "The food was excellent, sir," Malcolm answered carefully. "Thank you for the voucher." Redgrave's gaze dropped to Malcolm's tunic, his expression hardening as he noticed the wine stain. "What's this?" "A small accident with wine, sir. Nothing significant. Though in my experience, wine stains on uniforms often have stories attached to them, stories worth hearing." Malcolm related the previous evening's events, his account precise and factual. Throughout his report, Captain Redgrave's expression darkened progressively. "They called your uniform a costume?" Redgrave's voice was dangerously quiet when Malcolm finished. "Yes, sir, multiple times." "This isn't personal, Malcolm," Redgrave said, using his first name, a rarity that emphasized the seriousness of the situation. "When they disrespected you in that uniform, they disrespected the crown, the regiment, and generations of servicemen who have worn it with honour." Redgrave strode to his office, closing the door firmly behind him. Through the frosted glass, Malcolm could see the captain's silhouette as he picked up his phone. Though the words were muffled, the controlled anger in Redgrave's tone carried clearly. Several minutes later, the captain emerged with grim satisfaction. "Richard Montgomery and I served together for 15 years, Redgrave explained. "He's absolutely livid about your treatment. He's been away in Edinburgh, leaving his establishment in the hands of this Philip person. A decision he now deeply regrets. Montgomery will be at his restaurant within the hour. He's requested that we join him this evening at 8. He intends to address this situation personally and wants you there." "Sir, that's not necessary." "It is absolutely necessary," Redgrave stated firmly. "This isn't about a free meal or wounded pride. It's about respect for what we represent. Will you join me?" "Yes, sir." "Good. I'll meet you at the main entrance at 7:30. Formal uniform, of course." At precisely 7:30 that evening, Malcolm arrived at the palace gates in his full ceremonial uniform. Captain Redgrave appeared moments later, and a black Bentley pulled up to collect them. "Richard Montgomery is a good man," Redgrave said during the journey. "What happened last night was a betrayal of his values as much as an insult to you." As they arrived at the Sovereign Room, Malcolm noticed the entire front-of-house staff lined up at the entrance like an honour guard. At their centre stood a distinguished silver-haired gentleman, Lord Montgomery himself. "Captain Redgrave, Sergeant Bennett," Montgomery greeted them. "Welcome to the Sovereign Room." Inside, the pianist was playing God Save the Queen, and the restaurant's patrons were dressed more formally than the previous evening. Montgomery led them to the best table in the house. "Before we begin," Montgomery said, "there are some who need to address you directly." Miranda, the hostess, approached first. "Sergeant Bennett, I want to apologise for my part in your treatment last night. My behaviour was inexcusable and disrespectful." Next came Philip, no longer carrying his smug authority. Sergeant Bennett, Captain Redgrave, I failed in my responsibilities last night in the most fundamental way. The disrespect shown to you reflects a failure of character on my part. Finally, Sebastian approached, his earlier condescension replaced by remorse. Sergeant, my behaviour was deliberately disrespectful and resulted in damage to your uniform. There is no excuse for what I did. I wish to offer my sincere apology. Malcolm studied the three of them, aware that the entire restaurant had fallen silent. With measured control, he nodded once. Apologies accepted, he said simply, his dignity and forgiveness as evident as it had been in enduring their disrespect. Montgomery stepped forward again. I have offered these individuals the opportunity to resign rather than face immediate termination. That decision, however, ultimately rests with you, Sergeant. Lord Montgomery, Malcolm began, I believe the apologies offered appear genuine. Perhaps this incident can serve as an opportunity for growth rather than merely punishment. Montgomery raised an eyebrow. You're more merciful than many would be in your position, Sergeant. The uniform represents something greater than personal grievances, Malcolm replied. Holding on to resentment serves neither them nor the values we uphold. As they departed, Montgomery seated himself at the table. A surprising choice, Sergeant. Many in your position would have demanded termination. Vindictiveness rarely improves situations, Malcolm replied, and everyone deserves the opportunity to learn from mistakes. Sebastian, assigned as their waiter under close supervision, approached with newfound humility. As the meal progressed, Montgomery shared stories of his military service alongside Redgrave. You know, Sergeant Bennett, I was in uniform myself for 22 years before opening this restaurant. Royal Artillery served alongside Charles in the Gulf. This restaurant grew from my second passion, but I've never forgotten where I came from, Montgomery continued, which is why your treatment last night was particularly unacceptable. By the meal's conclusion, what had begun as a formal apology had evolved into a genuine exchange. Montgomery raised his glass for a final toast. To service in all its forms, he proposed, whether in combat, on ceremonial duty, or yes, even in restaurants. When done with pride and respect, all service has dignity. As they prepared to leave, several other diners approached to express their respect. One elderly gentleman identified himself as a veteran and shook Malcolm's hand firmly. The uniform still matters to those of us who understand what it represents, he said quietly. Outside, Malcolm paused to look back at the restaurant. Not quite how I expected this evening to unfold, he admitted to Captain Redgrave. Sometimes respect must be taught rather than assumed, Redgrave replied, but once learned, it's rarely forgotten. As they drove back toward the palace, Malcolm reflected on the transformation he'd witnessed. The same restaurant that had humiliated him 24 hours earlier had become the setting for one of the most respectful evenings of his career. The wine stain would eventually fade from his tunic, but the lesson of the experience would remain. A reminder that dignity comes not from how others treat you, but from how you conduct yourself when faced with disrespect. And in that, Sergeant Malcolm Bennett had proven himself every bit the guardian his uniform proclaimed him to be. Have you ever been judged unfairly based on your appearance or uniform? How did you handle it? It's easy to respond to disrespect with anger, but Sergeant Bennett showed that sometimes dignity and restraint can be more powerful than retaliation. What would you have done in Malcolm's position? Demanded termination for those who disrespected you, or granted the second chance he offered? Your perspective might reveal more about your character than you realize. If this story touched you, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our daily Royal Guard stories. Share this video with someone who appreciates stories about dignity, respect, and the true meaning of service. Our previous videos are appearing on your screen right now. Why not check them out next? We'll see you tomorrow at the same time with another brand new story you won't want to miss.